we're trying to understand the state of play. A great deal is happening. He was warning about the US backing of Israel, that undivided backing. I did push him in terms of, are you warning the people of the United States of America in country? He was very clear, a major escalation of this war would open on all fronts for him. Of course, you've got to ask yourself what strength and control he still has with Hezbollah and Hamas. Where are we in terms of the global geopolitics for Israel? Good morning.
Morning, and thanks for having me. Well, you know, I was watching that clip with interest. The most charitable thing you can say about the foreign minister of Iran is that he was being disingenuous. Iran does not fight directly against Israel. It uses an assortment of different Arab proxies. Iran is quite happy to fight Israel until the last Arab. That's been true for a couple of decades now. The fact that every so often an Iranian official comes up and warns about the escalation and expansion of the conflict should be taken very seriously.
But that's how they deliver terror, isn't it?
Exactly
that is
right.
the personification of terror.
That's exactly right. They use terror groups like Hamas, like Hezbollah, the Houthis, the Shiite groups in Iraq, and they have already been ratcheting up the activities of these groups. There have been missiles being fired all the way from Yemen to Israel. So it's one thing for him to say we're not sending more forces. The whole trick is they don't have to send more forces. They have local proxies that they have cultivated, trained, armed, financed for decades that they can use to deploy whenever it suits them.
So Bobby, and great to see you this morning. So when he talks about the U.S.'s involvement, saying things like the U.S. Is running the war, and the threats he expressed with Manis and earlier on about the U.S. should back away from their involvement or face that kind of escalation. Is that threat then more concentrated on, you say, as those sort of proxy groups or something more direct, something more, I don't know, pernicious between directly Iran and the U.S.? Should we make that of those types of threats?
No, I think the use of proxy groups is the most pernicious part of it, because the Iranians can always use somebody else's shoulders from which to fire at the United States, and whether it's directly against U.S. targets or the targets of U.S. allies in the region. Israel, of course, the UAE, Saudi Arabia. There are plenty of points in the Middle East that Iran can attack and hurt the United States, hurt our allies, and hurt the global economy. This has been the threat that Iran has posed for many, many years, and that has not changed. I can't imagine that Iran will directly get involved in this fight, because whenever they have done so, it has been to great cost to the Iranian people and the Iranian nation. And as long as they have other people to do their fighting, why bother get involved directly?
Well, we did actually touch on his visit to Qatar, the $6 billion, the hostage exchange. We touched on his lobbying, in theory, with Hamas to release the civilian hostages, and that came up a couple of weeks ago in Qatar. Can we just pivot to the U.S. side? We have funding. We have a new Speaker of the House. Therefore, we will see an accelerated program on war funding, defense funding for Israel and Ukraine. But it looks as if, in the first instance, that this is going to be split in two. What size of funding and how important a message is that to the world, that America stands with Israel but not with Ukraine in terms of funding? Because that is the takeaway message if the funding is split.
That is how the rest of the world will see it, and that is how the White House...
Russia will see it.
And Russia, and that's how the White House would like the rest of the world to see it. I mean, this framing of putting the Ukrainian funding and the Israeli funding together in one, this is President Biden's framing. You remember the speech from last week in which he put these two things together. He made the argument that these are part of a continuum, that these are part of threats to the United States that need to be looked at as a whole rather than individually. So yes, there will be a perception outside of the U.S. that there is a softening of America's support for Ukraine. This comes at a particularly bad time. The big question is whether the Europeans step up and increase their support for Ukraine, whether that burden, if you like, can be shared with European allies, other NATO allies, where they take up the sort of heavy load of supporting Ukraine while the United States, for a little time anyway, supports Israel.
Bobby, on the ground in Israel and in Gaza, the way that's been characterized of the current approach is, instead of a massive ground invasion, a slower, day by day, taking it an approach based on casualties. The market has interpreted that approach one way as de-escalation, seeming to play itself through these oil markets. But does that kind of approach change the narrative at all of Israel's war against Hamas?
Oh, I'm afraid that events on the ground are moving too quickly for us to take a sort of safe position on that. If I were sort of in the oil futures business, I would not be so sanguine. I think events are changing even as we speak. It has been remarkable that Israel has not gone in, that sort of ground invasion that we've been expecting for 3 weeks has not yet taken place. But I can't imagine that
Do you think
it'll remain
Netanyahu
like
still
that.
has the global support for that open-ended global support?
No, he has not. A lot of that support that we saw in the first few days after the October 7th attack has sort of faded away. But he still has substantial support within Israel. There's an appetite within Israel for vengeance, for a reckoning on what happened on the 2nd of October, and that's going to guide his actions more than anything else.
Okay, Bobby, thank you so much getting up early this Monday morning to give us the context on the Hamas-Israel war. Bobby Ghosh, Bloomberg Opinion columnist. You can pick up his opinion on the Bloomberg terminal.